So this evening's talk is by Deanna Ferree Womack, and she'll be talking about Protestants, gender, and the Arab Renaissance. So a little bit of introduction about Dr. Womack. She is Associate Professor of History of Religious and Interfaith Studies at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. I think I'm right in saying that's in Atlanta, Georgia. Her research focuses on Protestant missions in the Middle East, Middle Eastern Christianity, and Christian-Muslim relations. She is the author of Protestants, Gender, and the Arab Renaissance, so the subject of her talk this evening. Also, in 2020, she wrote about neighbors, Christians and Muslims building community, and also she was the author of Reinventing Islam, Gender, and the Protestant Roots of American Islamophobia. That was most recently. She is co-editor of the Edinburgh Studies in Middle Eastern Christianity book series and co-editor with Raimundo Barreto of Alterity and the Evasion of Justice, Explorations of the Other in World Christianity. And her current research project on Middle Eastern Christian migration to the Americas is supported by a Louisville Institute grant for researchers. So I will stop sharing. I'll invite Deanna to share her screen. So after Deanna's talk, there'll be an opportunity for comments and questions. Please turn your video on, raise a hand, use the Zoom function, and I will spot you and invite you to put your question or comment. So Deanna, welcome. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Quentin and Craig, for inviting me, and everyone for joining us today. I'm delighted to be able to speak about my book, Protestants, Gender, and the Arab Renaissance in Late Ottoman Syria. If you need to stop me for any reason, I'm not sure I can see the chat with all the screens that are going on, and so just feel free to let me know. But I'll just go ahead and begin then. As numerical minorities within today's Middle Eastern Christian population, Arab Protestants are seldom the subject of scholarly attention, especially in histories of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Existing studies center instead on American missionary activities, and in recent years, a number of fascinating publications and conference papers have focused on Western Christian missions to Arabs, Turks, Armenians, Persians, Assyrians, and other Middle Eastern populations. This subject was once only of interest to scholars at Christian religious institutions. However, the fact that many books on these topics have now come out of top university presses suggests that Middle Eastern mission history has become a recognized, if still relatively small, area of study for historians and for researchers in Middle Eastern studies. Here are a few such key publications that have come out over the past couple of decades. Heather Sharkey's American Evangelicals in Egypt, Usama Makdisi's Artillery of Heaven, and Beth Barron's The Orphan Scandal. No, the same is not yet true for the study of Christianity itself in the Middle East in terms of the number of monographs that are focusing on this subject. So my book, Protestants, Gender, and the Arab Renaissance in Late Ottoman Syria, argues that such research centered on actual Middle Eastern Christians is necessary to balance the historical narrative that has centered mostly on Protestant missionaries from Europe and the United States. This book is part of an Edinburgh University Press series titled Alternative Histories that encourages scholars to investigate the following two questions, which I offer to you for your consideration as you listen to the presentation. First, whose histories are included in studies on Levantine history? And second, what stories have been left untold? In my book, I answer that the diverse Christian communities of the Middle East have often been neglected in Middle Eastern studies and in Christian historical studies too, at least until quite recently, with more media attention drawn to the plight of Christians in Middle Eastern conflicts. Yet even with a rising scholarly interest in areas like Coptic studies, the focus has been overwhelmingly on contemporary political issues, and the most outstanding studies have been conducted by ethnographers, not by historians. For example, here are two recent books, Saba Mahmood's Religious Difference in a Secular Age, and Angie Hu's The Political Lives of Saints, Christian-Muslim Mediation in Egypt, so both focusing on Coptic Christianity as ethnographers. In contrast, the modern history of Christians in the Middle East has received less attention. Since the publication of my book in 2019, I am glad to note some advances in this area. I've written about these in the introduction to an edited volume by Brill that's going to be published actually next month on Christianity in the contemporary Middle East. But for now, I will just note two such advances. Mitri Rahab's Politics of Persecution, Middle Eastern Christians in an Age of Empire provides an accessible history from the late 18th century to present. And then Edinburgh University Press has established one of the only university press series on Middle Eastern Christianity specifically, with books that offer a deeper dive into particular Christian histories in the region. These are the two that have come out to date, one by Bernard Héberger and then one by Robert Haddad, which will come out in January. So in aiming to help rectify the gap that I see in historical studies, my book has responded in particular to the neglected history of the Ottoman Syrians, who formed the first Arabic-speaking Protestant community in the 19th century in what is today Syria and Lebanon. It offers a fresh historical account of the encounters of the Syrian Protestant community with American missionaries, Eastern churches, and Muslims at the height of the Arab Renaissance, or the Nahda, in Beirut from 1860 to 1915. The book challenges the type of historiography on American encounters in the Middle East that places Western male actors at center stage. Instead, it reveals how Syrian Protestant women and men were agents of their own history, who sought to create a modern Syria while adapting and challenging missionary teachings. In doing so, these pioneers of Arab Protestantism established a critical link between Protestant practices and the sociocultural currents of the Arab Renaissance. In sum, while other histories of the Middle East have depicted such Protestant authors as secular intellectuals whose contributions were only cultural and humanitarian, my research reveals the religiosity of both well-known and overlooked Syrian Protestant writers who played a large part in the sociocultural and religious transformations of the 19th and early 20th century Arab world. From the standpoint of Middle Eastern history, then, these voices deserve to be included in the histories that we tell. Yet, as I indicated earlier, scholars of Christian history appear to be invested in telling a different history, either a traditional history that depicts Western Christians as true representatives of Christianity, or, as in the emerging field of world Christianity studies, an alternative history of global South Christians that nevertheless gives very little attention to Christians in and from the Middle East. So it is important that my book presents the early history of Protestants in Lebanon and Syria in order to bring historians of the Middle East and historians of world Christianity into conversation. And so those are kind of the two fields that I'm working with in my book. Now, the remainder of the presentation will be divided into three parts. I'll introduce the context of Ottoman Syria during the Arab Renaissance, or Nahda. I will address the book's methodology, and then I'll survey the Syrian Protestant history using some snapshots from each of my book's chapters. And then I conclude with some questions about gender and exclusion or inclusion of women and other particular themes in histories of the Middle East. So first, to the context of Syrian Protestants during the Nahda in late Ottoman Syria. This book picks up where most works on the American Syria mission have left off, in 1860, when civil war rent the fabric of Ottoman Syrian society and massacres in Mount Lebanon and Damascus threw the fledgling Protestant community into chaos. It also focuses on gender and the activities of women in the Syrian Protestant community that other books have admitted. omitted. In the pivotal decades that followed this sectarian violence between Christians, Druzes, and Muslims, women survivors sought to resurrect the first Arabic-speaking Protestant church, known as the Syrian Evangelical Church. These women pioneered a Protestant women's movement known as the Bible Women, while at the same time American and British missionary women in the late 19th century Syria came to outnumber missionary men. Here you see a picture of the American Arabic press in Beirut. During the same period, Syrian Protestant women and men used the American mission press there in Beirut to advance the Arab Renaissance, a religiously diverse revival central to the story of Protestantism in late Ottoman Syria. The era now known as the Nahda or the Renaissance has been characterized variously as an Arab awakening or the liberal age of Arabic thought or an Arabic print revolution. The last designation relates to one facet of the multi-causal Renaissance in the Ottoman Arab provinces, which included both a cultural movement that unfolded throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries and a political movement that arose toward the end of the 19th century. As Ami Aylan described the Nahda, among its prominent marks were an increase in literary and linguistic creativity and an excited journalistic enterprise. Opening up new intellectual vistas, the enterprise engaged members of the society's educated classes in a vivid written discourse on questions of modernity and cultural identity, and encouraged the spread of learning and literacy. Nahda is also used in a different, essentially political sense, to denote the vocal quest for national liberation, political rights, and individual freedom that ensued, or rather emanated from the cultural ferment of that period. The Ottoman administration's modernizing reforms, or tanzimat, and encounters with Western ideas and technologies influenced the emerging intelligentsia and rising middle class in Ottoman Beirut in the 19th century. While 17th and 18th century revivals among Maronites and Melkites positioned Christians in Syria well to take advantage of these changing tides. Yet, we should also note that Muslim intellectuals in Cairo and Istanbul had engaged in significant Arabic production before the mid-19th century flowering of Arab Christian literary activity. The cultural and political ferment of the Nahda, therefore, was not limited to one geographical region, time period, or originating cause. But for Syrian Protestants, Beirut became a hub for the Nahda, and thus its transformation in the 19th century from a provincial town into a bustling port city provides the backdrop for my book. By the 1870s, Beirut had emerged as a new cultural and literary center, which gave rise to dozens of missionary, ecclesiastical, and private printing presses, to the increased production and consumption of Arabic books and periodicals, and to the foundation of scholarly societies, literary salons, and modern educational institutions. Beirut was the capital for a series of shifting Ottoman administrative districts and an imperial center for urban development, industrialization, and commerce, known for its mercantile enterprises. Changing conceptions of what it meant to be modern, as well as new local understandings of political and sectarian identity, also spread outward from the city into rural areas through literary networks and through the communication systems of various ta'ifas, or religious sects, religious denominations. In attending to the cultural currents of the Nahda, including these religious movements in Ottoman Syria, I examined the intertwined histories of Protestant missionaries and local residents until 1915, when famine and other effects of World War I shifted missionary attention to humanitarian relief. Now, most studies locate the growth of Syrian Protestantism and the rise of the modern Arabic press on the timeline of American missionary activities beginning in 1819, when the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, or ABCFM, appointed Levi Parsons and Pliny Fisk to begin the first American mission in the Mediterranean. Following Parsons' death, Fisk and 4 new missionary recruits settled in Beirut in 1823, and the rest was history, or so the familiar account goes. The American Syria Mission established the first Syrian Evangelical Church in Beirut in 1848. In 1865, missionary Cornelius van Dyck completed his translation of the Arabic Bible, printed in the now famous American Arabic font at the American Mission Press. And in 1866, American educational efforts culminated in the founding of Syrian Protestant College, which is now the American University of Beirut. By 1870, when the ABCFM transferred the mission to the control of the Presbyterian Church in the United States, the Americans had established an enduring presence in the Middle East, or so the story goes. Although the population of Syrian Protestants remained small, Protestant schools educated numerous Syrian intellectuals, and according to missionary reports, the work of the mission press sparked the literary renaissance that spread from Beirut to Cairo and thence throughout the wider Arab world. Now, this overview that I've just given, and indeed much of the existing literature, presents the modern encounter between Protestant missionaries and Ottoman Arabs as a tale of cause and effect in an essentially American missionary project, establishing a pattern that has characterized American representations of their own involvements in Syria and Lebanon up to the present. Similar stories of Western agents as the primary actors on a foreign stage have emerged from multiple studies of the missionary movement, whether the action took place in the Middle East or in other regions of the world. Yet what Western Christians have often put forth as a universal history is actually little more than a tribal history, an ethnocentric telling of the larger global story, to adapt the words of world Christianity scholar Dale Irvin. Such narrow histories overlook the agency of local Christians and other non-Western residents, and also tend to exclude women's contributions to religion and society. In the traditional mode of mission history, reflected, for example, in the works of Kenneth Scott Latourette, American and European men are the main characters in this unfolding saga of Western Christian expansion. In contrast, a polyphonic tune emerges when we identify this dominant narrative as just one strand of the story and set it alongside others. In the case of the American Syria mission, this means reading women's perspectives along with those of men and examining missionary publications as well as the writings of Syrian Protestant intellectuals, mission school graduates, Catholic and Greek Orthodox clergy, and Islamic reformists. By recognizing Syrian agents and their own Syrians as agents in their own history, and identifying the gender dimensions of the missionary encounter, this book pushes beyond male-oriented narratives about American Protestants and the American Syrian mission. So here are some of the faces that you will meet in my book. Nijma Atik and Salim Kassab I'll speak about a little bit later. Ibrahim Hourani, a poet, Hana Kourani, a journalist and author, Khalil Sarkis, a press owner and magazine founder, and Yusuf Atiyah, an evangelist who wrote many religious tracts for the American Mission Press. The thick and nuanced history of such Syrian Protestants and their interlocutors presented in the book is rooted in the global context of modern missions and Western imperialism, embedded in the Ottoman Arab movements of the Nahda, the Arab Renaissance, and attentive to the gendered power dynamics of these intersecting histories. So I'll say a little bit more now about my research methodology. To tell a more comprehensive history of the missionary encounter in Ottoman Syria and of Syrian Protestantism, I seek a balance between those existing studies that tell, either appreciatively or critically, a missionary story overseas, and those that romanticize local resistance by writing from a so-called native perspective. This book seeks to avoid false dichotomies between East and West, between missionary action and native resistance, and between Syrians' cultural and religious identities by presenting a story of mutual encounter between missionaries and Ottoman residents who became entangled or enmeshed in each other's history, rather than placing either American Protestants or Syrians at the center. As Daniel Rogers' book Atlantic Crossings exemplified, and Heather Sharkey applied to Middle Eastern missions, this approach interprets the missionary encounter as intensely local, global, and transnational at once. During the Syrian missionary encounter, such geographical entanglements included the flow of missionaries back and forth between the United States and the Ottoman Empire, the movement of Syrians to Europe and the Americas, the sending of Syrian money, goods, correspondence, and printed media across these regions, and the exchange of news and friendly Christian sentiment between Syrian Protestants and new Protestant churches in Africa and Asia. Within this setting, Protestant missionaries and Syrians from diverse religious communities encountered, challenged, and changed one another in profound ways, leaving their lives inextricably entwined. So I employ the term enmeshed history, not only as an interpretive framework, but also as a method for seeking out and reading source materials. This means incorporating the voices of multiple participants in the missionary encounter, and particularly those of Syrian Protestants, whose beliefs, motivations, and activities most mission studies and Middle Eastern histories neglect. This approach also informs my treatments of two forms of patriarchy that I find are embedded in the Syrian missionary encounter. Whoops. Paternalistic power, or the hierarchy of a father over children, manifested itself in the efforts of Western missionary men to exercise tutelage over Syrian men, and masculinist power, or structured gender inequality, which relegated American women to overseeing girls' schools or missionary households, as upheld by missionary men and women alike. And this often excluded Syrian women from positions of institutional authority in the Protestant community. Syrian and American Protestants alike upheld the Nahdawi concept, or the Arab Renaissance concept, of the printed word as a cultural force, and saw it also as a key component in evangelical conversions. So by comparing their articulations of evangelical or Protestant identity, I demonstrate how religious change played out in the context of the Nahda, emanating from Beirut into the wider sectarian landscape of post-1860 Syria. I begin my exploration of Syrian Protestant identity with this focus, following the approach of anthropologists of world Christianity, who stress the importance of first attending carefully to the meanings people use in constructing their actions. This sentiment matches the compelling case that Middle Eastern historian Akram Khater made for taking religious experience seriously. He said, "We need to write histories of religion that are not dedicated solely to telling the stories of religious institutions and intellectuals, or to describing religion as a social and political force. Rather, and difficult though it may be, we must narrate tales of faith and belief, those intangible, powerful elements of the human experience. We must allow a role for the supernatural in human history by accepting that it moved individuals and communities in small and great ways, even if it does not move us in a similar manner." Khater's analysis in his study of an 18th century Maronite movement applies equally to my research on Syrian Protestantism. And then I'll just share that my research drew from materials in two primary archives: the archive of the American Syrian Mission and American Mission Press, which is held at the Near East School of Theology in Beirut. It's preserved the writing of Syrian and Lebanese Protestants. And I used the papers of the Syria Mission at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But because Syrian Protestantism was also enmeshed in British missionary history, particularly through a female-led society called the British Syrian Mission, my research also took me to the University of Durham Library Archives and Special Collections and the archives of the Center for Muslim Christian Studies in Oxford. Now I'll turn to the snapshots, attempting to show you an enmeshed story of Nahdawi Protestantism, as I explain the themes addressed in each of the book's 5 chapters. So chapter 1. In 1870, the Protestant intellectual Butrus al-Bustani established his pioneering journal in Beirut, Al-Jinan, or the Gardens. Al-Bustani, who worked as a translator for the American Mission Press, is arguably the most well-known of many Syrian evangelical church members who contributed to the Arab Renaissance. He is named as well alongside the secular Christian intellectuals and Muslim reformists featured in most studies on the Nahda. Yet for Syrian Protestants, al-Bustani was an evangelical exemplar. His widely disseminated biography of the first Syrian Protestant, As'ad Shedyak, provided a model testimony of faith that other prominent converts to Protestantism followed when telling their own narratives. As my first chapter explained, these figures adopted Protestantism in the mid to late 19th century and also embraced the Nahdawi aspirations that al-Bustani embodied, a commitment to science, modern education, Arabic literary production, public intellectual discourse, and social progress in Syria. These pursuits were compatible with Protestant religiosity, along with traditions of Bible reading and evangelistic printing. In affirming this, Syrian Protestants formed a link between their missionary partners and the intellectual and religious leaders of other religious communities in late Ottoman Syria. So chapter 1 examines 6 Protestant conversion narratives, some written in Arabic and others written in English, published or written between 1860 and 1912, placing them in the context of the Arab Renaissance. In addition to Bustani's account of Asad Shidyak's conversion, I consider the autobiographical narratives of 4 other men, Saliba Jarwan, who you see pictured here along with his wife, Salim Kassab, Nasim al-Helu, and Kamil al-Itani. And then I consider the narrative of one woman, because there aren't as many conversion narratives written by women that have been preserved, and that's Leah Barakat. Only one of these individuals, Kamil al-Itani, was a convert from Islam. The others, like the vast majority of Syrians who became Protestant, were already Christian, having grown up in Orthodox or Melkite or Maronite traditions. Noting that missionaries played various roles in editing and publishing such accounts, I find that converts to Protestantism strongly emphasize the role of Bible reading in their conversions, attributing their religious transformations more to the experience of reading the Gospels and the working of the Holy Spirit than to the labors of American missionaries, who, for their part, often seemed ready to take all the credit for each individual who was added to the Protestant fold. Such conversion accounts by Syrians, then, subtly remind readers of Syrian agency, despite the financial, administrative, and religious power that male missionaries especially wielded over Syrian churches, schools, and other institutions. Take, for example, the conversion narrative of Leah al-Khazin Barakat. She was born around 1858 and died in 1940. She told this account in her English language book, published in 1912 after she migrated to the U.S. It was titled Message from Mount Lebanon. Born to a Maronite family in the Mount Lebanon region, Barakat attended several American and German mission schools before embracing the Protestant faith as a student at the American Female Seminary. While she spoke of her missionary peers with respect and praise, she also claimed that American Christianity was, quote, simply the fruit of foreign missionary work, end quote, done by her own Syrian ancestors who brought the light of the gospel out from the land of the Bible. And so here is part of her attempt to balance the historical narrative. Moving to chapter 2, I turn to the fruits of the American mission press, which missionaries established in Beirut to spread their interpretation of Christianity and promote evangelical conversions. As the 19th century advanced, however, the press quickly became a site of American-Syrian collaboration and a means for Syrian Protestants to participate fully in the sociocultural and religious discourses of the Nahda. Syrian men who wrote for the American mission press from the 1870s onward were well versed in the discourses published at independent Syrian presses and in literary scientific periodicals that we might designate as secular for their lack of religious affiliation. Nahdawi Protestants like the Beirut Church deacon and American Mission Press employee Ibrahim Hourani, who you see here, contributed to these cultural currents through Arabic poetry, scientific studies, and commentaries on modern society published at the Mission Press. They also engaged in Nahdawi production in their writings on Islam and through press debates with Jesuit missionaries and with Catholic and Greek Orthodox Syrians. Together, such authors made the religious presses of Beirut a locus of dynamic encounters and passionate contestations that attracted readers and new Nahdawi writers from outside of Beirut, extending the Nahda to the homes, schools, churches, and public meeting spaces of rural Syria. This expands the usual interpretation of the Arab Renaissance as a secular movement and uncovers its religious dimensions. And I'd like to highlight one example of the aforementioned Ibrahim Hourani, who edited the American Mission Press periodical An-Nashra al-Usbu'iyya, or the Weekly Bulletin, and turned it into a key mouthpiece of the Protestant Nahda. Besides Bible lessons and sermons or reports on the Protestant community activities, which we might expect from such a journal, the columns under Hourani's management featured current events, scientific and medical discoveries, speeches by prominent intellectuals, pieces on controversial topics like Darwinism, appeals for women's rights and education, increasingly written by Syrian women, reprints from Arab and European periodicals, and verses of Arabic poetry. To the latter, Hourani himself was a prime contributor, becoming the first writer of the 20th century to publish Islamic-style rhymed prose poetry, or shi'r manthur. His first series appeared in An-Nashra, the Mission Journal, in 1902, and preceded the earliest publications of prose poetry by the renowned Maronite authors Khalil Gibran and Amin Arihani in 1903 and 1905, respectively. Hourani's use of An-Nashra to contribute to a new movement of modern Arabic poetry was one of the reasons why his obituary called him the leading Arabic scholar of his day. In his writings, the evangelical faith and the cultural forms of the Arab Renaissance converged, a reality not taken into account by many studies that present the Arab Renaissance as a secular phenomenon. In Chapter 3, my foregrounding of Syrian women's voices expands the usual interpretation of the Arab Renaissance as well. For to borrow a phrase from Chandra Mohanty, under Western eyes, too often Middle Eastern women have been rendered a homogeneous group, bound by shared oppression. Missionary men spoke about them, and missionary women spoke for them, endeavoring to save their Syrian sisters while advancing their own positions in a religious enterprise controlled by men. Yet Syrian women spoke too, and often. They found in the American Mission Press an avenue for influencing a wider audience through a medium, printed Arabic, that few missionary women in Syria had the skill, interest, or support to employ. So Syrian women first signed their names to sermonic texts and articles on education and child rearing for the mission periodical An-Nashra in the 1880s, and they began publishing books and novels at the Mission Press in the 1890s. These largely neglected texts put Nahdawi Protestant women at the forefront of the Arab women's awakening that gained momentum in the early 20th century. The Nahdawi women joined Protestant men at the AMP in printing speeches, articles, books, and poetry that extolled the richness of ancient Arab Islamic civilization, for example, and praised the modernization efforts of the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, Abdulhamid II. They also wrote to advance women's education and the role of women in securing the future for the nation. Syrian women used the periodical An-Nashra in particular to disseminate religious messages, similar to sermons that their male counterparts preached in the Protestant churches, at a time when such formal ministerial activities were considered the purview of men. So I'd like to introduce you briefly to three of these Nahdawi Protestant women, Hana Kasbani Kurani, Farida Atiyah, and Salma Badr. I have one picture, I have the picture of one of these women shown here. Pictures of women are a bit harder to find, but Hana Kasbani Kurani, who was born in 1870 and died in 1898, is the one that you see with the circular photo. She was born to parents who had joined the Syrian Evangelical Church in the mid-19th century. She studied at a British mission school and then at the American Mission's Beirut Female Seminary. After graduating in 1885, she taught at the American Girls' School in Tripoli and then married an intellectual, Amin Kurani. This was a marriage that ended in divorce, which was distinct because it was uncommon for Christians, as the churches prohibited divorce. Kurani also served as a Sunday school teacher and lecturer for the Protestant community in Beirut, and she began writing for the Mission Press and other Nahda journals in the early 1890s. She even toured as a lecturer in the United States after the Women's Congress at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, which she attended. Hannah gained such attention there that Susan B. Anthony invited her to address the 1894 convention of the National American Women Suffrage Association in Washington, D.C. Hana Korani is known for the debates that she had with a Shia Muslim author, Zainab Fawaz, on the pages of the Arabic press over the proper role of women in Syrian society, in which she disagreed with her Muslim counterpart's assertion that women could fulfill all the same public roles as men, including participation in politics. Hana appears to either have been far less progressive with this statement, or she was catering to the conservative views of women held by her American and Syrian Protestant peers. Among her publications for the American Mission Press were several translations and a book titled Manners and Customs, published in 1891, for which she received a medal from the Ottoman Sultan. The book was a treatise on the proper way of speaking and acting within society and included a section on child rearing, or tarbiyah, a genre of literature to which many Nahdawi women authors contributed. The second woman I wanted to introduce you to is Farida Atiyah, born in 1867, died in 1917. She was a graduate of the American Girls' School in Tripoli and the daughter of Yusuf Atiyah, the evangelist I mentioned earlier. So I do have a picture of him. We can go back just to see him. There's Yusuf Atiyah in the bottom corner. He was an evangelist employed by the American Mission who wrote a number of religious tracts aiming to draw both Arab Christians and Muslims to the Protestant faith. Farida was as prolific a writer as her father. She published a short novel entitled The Education of Women through the American Mission Press in 1893 and an independently published novel, Between Two Thrones, in 1912. The latter is more well known and thus has been acclaimed as one of the early Arabic novels written by a woman, although the former was written much earlier. Farida also contributed essays to a variety of Nahda periodicals, including the American Mission Press's An-Nashra. Among these was an article titled Caution and Warning, which took on a similar form and served a similar function as a prophetic sermon, as it expounded on a verse from the book of Jeremiah 9:4, which says, "Beware of your neighbors and put no trust in any of your kin, for all your kin are supplanters and every neighbor goes around like a slanderer." Farida cautioned her readers not to trust those whose loyalty had not been proven. As An-Nashra often published pieces that had been delivered as lectures at mission school events or other gatherings, I suspect that Farida may have read the piece in front of a listening audience. For although formal preaching in a church pulpit was off limits to Protestant women in late Ottoman Syria, public speaking was a common Arab Renaissance activity for both women and men. And then the third individual, Salma Badr, who was born in 1883, wrote a short piece in An-Nashra when she was 17 or 18 years old. And this demonstrates that church gatherings outside of Sunday worship could be a forum actually for Syrian Protestant women to share religious messages. In what I consider a sermonette, Salma spoke about the virtue of patience for a gathering of young women, expounding on the repeated verse in the text of Matthew 18, "Be patient with me," or the repeated phrase, "Be patient with me." The sermonette appeared in the American Mission Press periodical in 1900. Now, Salma was one of many Syrian Protestants in the early 20th century who migrated to the United States, likely facilitated by the English she learned when studying at the British Syrian Training College in Beirut. If you look at the picture of the 5 women seated with books in the middle of the screen, those are all graduates from the British Syrian Training College in Beirut. I don't think one of them is Salma, but these are perhaps some of her peers. Before she migrated to the US, however, she married a man named Khater Kiyami, and then in 1901 moved with him to Australia, where their daughter Salwa was born in 1905. According to members of the Kiyami family, Salma left her husband and returned to Syria. There she worked for a time as a Bible woman, a topic that I discuss further in chapter 5. And then in 1912, she immigrated with her daughter on this steamship, SS Invierna, to the United States, along with 3 other younger members of the Badr family. She settled in Brooklyn, obtained an official divorce from Kiyami, and then married a recent immigrant from Cairo, and perhaps joined the newly founded Syrian Protestant Church in Brooklyn. The manifest of Salma's steamship shows that she identified herself as a seamstress. I don't know if I zoom in, perhaps you can see here's the three Badr youth that came with her, and then Salma Kiyami and Salwa Kiyami. She identified herself as a seamstress and as a Syrian, not an Armenian. You can perhaps see that Armenian was written and then crossed out, and it says Syrian, so we know how she self-identifies. And it also said that she planned to meet her brother, Aman, who had already settled in New York. So this is a common pattern for migration from Syria. Also, on the next page of the manifest, I found quite interesting. It notes that she's of dark complexion with brown eyes and brown hair, and she was determined to be acceptable for entry into the United States because she was of good health and was neither a polygamist nor an anarchist. So these were important things to consider when allowing people to enter the United States in 1912. Now, in contrast to this accomplishment in the masculine domain of literary production, the accomplishment of women in that masculine domain, the absence of women's official roles was apparent in the church, the third component of the Syria mission along with its presses and schools, which I examine more deeply in chapter 4. Gendered expressions of institutional Protestantism came to the fore through the various means of communication that Syrian men employed to assert their agency and masculinity in situations where women were not present. Longtime members of the Evangelical Church of Beirut, like Khalil Sarkis, aired grievances with the mission over issues of ordination and church governance in the 1890s and clashed with one another in the process, resulting in a church schism. And Sarkis, I will note, was the founder of the Arabic periodical Lisan al-Hal in Beirut and was also the son-in-law of the Nahda pioneer Boutros al-Bustani. Although Bustani had died by this point, several members of that extended Sarkis and Bustani family were part of the church schism that I discuss in this chapter. This conflict and the anti-missionary pamphlet it produced displayed the asymmetrical power dynamics within the Syria mission and the relationship of intra-Protestant controversies in the Nahda. Now, the root cause of this schism was the American missionaries' tendency to hold too tightly on the reins of the Syrian evangelical churches, including controlling who could be ordained as a Syrian pastor and appointing the pastors of their choices to particular churches. So in the 1890s, a group of longtime male members of the Syrian Evangelical Church wanted the power to dismiss their current pastor and appoint the pastor of their choice. And over a series of tense letters and meetings and votes, this group of people decided to secede from the Syrian Evangelical Church of Beirut to form their own congregation along with their wives and daughters. About 30 people left. And they were able to convince the American missionaries to ordain a recent seminary graduate named Asad Zarub as their pastor by promising that they would fully fund his salary. So the mission allowed them to create a second church in Beirut because they determined to be financially independent from the mission. However, as the church began to grow, then the congregation decided that they needed to build their own building and they didn't have enough funds to create for the building campaign. The mission would not give them any money, and so eventually Pastor Zarub left for the U.S., where he endeavored to fundraise. Unfortunately, there he found American donors unreceptive. He was frustrated, and he returned empty-handed in February 1902 to Beirut. And when he arrived, he presented an English-language pamphlet titled Syria and the Mission Work to an Anglican clergyman who was associated with the British Syrian mission in Beirut. His name was H.B. Macartney. When Macartney passed the pamphlet to Henry Harris Jessup, one of the leading members of the American mission in Beirut, this began an 8-year missionary campaign to induce the evangelical independent church members to repudiate the document. Why? Because the 8-page pamphlet offered an alternative history of the American Syrian mission that highlighted ongoing tensions between the Americans and the Syrians, that praised the early missionaries of the ABCFM, the original Congregationalist mission organization, and lambasted the current Presbyterian missionaries for their domineering ways. The claims included that the governing of Syrian churches was done according to racial hierarchies, and that Syrian Protestant church members and mission employees were treated as servants and slaves. Among other grievances, the pamphlet claimed that when Reverend Zarub the faithful servant of God, as it said, was sent to the U.S. to raise funds for the church building. The missionaries sent letters to the American mission boards to prevent both Presbyterians and Congregationalists in the U.S. from supporting this endeavor. So to make this long story short, in this power struggle between American and Syrian Protestant men, Henry Jessup convinced the female director of the British Syrian mission, Caroline Thompson, to pressure her employee, who was a leading member of the independent church, Salim Kassab, to repudiate the pamphlet and leave the church. So you see Caroline Thompson sitting here with, surrounded by Bible women, and the man standing on, well, it's my left behind the framed photo. That's Salim Kassab. So he left the church, and this influenced others to leave the church, and soon Reverend Zarub signed a letter retracting the claims of the pamphlet, and he was dismissed as a pastor and immigrated back to the United States permanently. The two Protestant churches of Beirut united thereafter, but due to ongoing differences of opinion between missionaries and Syrians, the historic National Evangelical Church of Beirut, which you can still see in downtown Beirut today, would thereafter remain congregational rather than taking part in the missionaries' Presbyterian denomination. And now for chapter 5. While Syrian Protestant men contended with the male leaders of the American mission, as chapter 5 recounts, their counterparts in the Bible women's movement found few openings for employment as Bible readers and preachers within the American Syrian mission. So the Americans didn't hire many Bible women. Therefore, subtly asserting their agency in the face of missionary authority, many of these Syrian women turned to the female-led British Syria mission to support their preaching vocations. The stories of these Syrian women evangelists, among them Nijma Atik, who advanced their own spiritual authority in the Protestant community outside of traditional clerical structures, are more elusive than any other told in this volume. You can see Nijma Atik in the center of this collage of photos labeled C, and I'll say a little bit more about her in a moment. To apply Richard Fox Young's maxim regarding global Christianity, what happens on the margins beyond the established churches of Euro-American origin is also worth noting. Although omitted from most studies on the Syria mission and on the Arab Renaissance, the voices of Syrian Protestant women are critical because their efforts, outside the bounds of the church and beyond the male missionary gaze, actually built and sustained the Syrian evangelical church. Because Syrian Bible women were often not as highly educated as Nahdawi women author activists, these Bible women preachers rarely wrote articles for the American Mission Press periodical and rarely published accounts of their work. So without such materials, it was much harder for me to reconstruct their lives and activities, or sometimes even to determine the full names of these Syrian women. And I had to glean much information by reading between the lines of missionary writings and searching the Syrian Evangelical Church membership records. So before concluding, I want to introduce you briefly to one such Bible woman, the aforementioned Nijma Atik. Nijma, who again you can see labeled in the center, labeled C, was a widow from the Greek Orthodox community in Mount Lebanon, who converted to Protestantism after escaping the sectarian violence of 1860 in her mountain village. She fled to Beirut, where she encountered Protestant teachings in a makeshift school for women refugees, established by the British Syrian mission founder, Elizabeth Bowen Thompson. Like a number of other women who fled to Beirut at that time, the British Syrian mission later employed her, and she became a pioneer of the Bible women's movement in Syria that took shape in the aftermath of the Civil War. Like Bible women who worked in other parts of the globe at this time, often supported from the London Bible and Domestic Female Mission, Nijma was a preacher who was paid a very low wage to read and explain the Bible to women in their homes. Working behind the scenes in women's spaces where neither missionary men nor ordained Syrian male ministers could go, Nijma and other Syrian Bible women actually ministered both to women and men. And through their preaching and pastoral counsel, they rebuilt the Protestant church at a time when members had been dispersed and many of the men had been killed. So the act of war and violence gave an opportunity for women to assert their religious leadership. Yet their efforts have been largely unrecognized, as the typical history has privileged missionary accomplishments and the work of Syrian men. So as I conclude, I'd like to return to the themes that I raised at the beginning of this presentation and offer a further reflection on one of the questions. What stories have been left untold in Middle Eastern or Levantine history? In the course of my research for this book, I found that much of the history of Syrian women and of Syrian Protestant women in particular has remained untold. These women have been excluded from historical studies because some scholars have been invested in telling other stories. They've been excluded also because materials on women's lives have not been as well preserved or are sometimes different than the types of textual materials used to document the histories of men's lives. But Syrian Protestant women have also been excluded because even scholars who are seeking alternative histories nevertheless assume that women's voices and experiences cannot be recovered. Before visiting the archive of the American Mission Press in Beirut and physically flipping through each page of each issue of the journal An-Nashra to identify the names of women authors, I had also found little evidence in existing scholarship that the women of the Syrian Protestant community were actively involved in the literary currents of the Arab Renaissance. I hope, therefore, that my book not only contributes more information about the lives and activities of Nahdawi Protestant women, author activists, and Bible women preachers, but that it also provides future scholars with more impetus for continuing to investigate the lives of the women in the Levant in the late Ottoman period. Reflecting back on this book now in the light of my current research on Middle Eastern Christian diasporas in North and South America, I want to finally note that the stories of Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox churches built by Arab, Armenian, and Syriac immigrants also remain largely untold in the literature on Levantine history. Several of my snapshots, if you'll recall, showed how significant the currents of migration were for Syrian Christians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Salma Badr, the seamstress in Brooklyn, migrated back and forth between Australia and Syria before relocating to New York. The controversial pastor Asad Zaroub traveled to the U.S., first to fundraise, and then later, when he was dismissed, he settled permanently in the U.S. He lived in Massachusetts for a while and then moved to Arkansas, where he underwent a change in vocation and ran Zaroub's Oriental Bazaar into the 1930s. Leah Barakat also settled in the U.S., in Philadelphia, where she worked to promote missions and published her autobiography in English. And the Nahdawi author Hana Qurani stayed in the U.S. for more than a year after traveling to the Women's Congress at the Chicago World's Fair. But she ultimately returned to Syria, like many other migrants who worked abroad for a time and then returned home with their earnings. These patterns of migration that began with Syrian Christians in the late 19th century would only increase in the 20th century, with rising numbers migrating or fleeing from Palestine, Egypt, Lebanon, and Iraq. While there is significant literature in Arab American studies documenting the history of Middle Eastern migration to the U.S., and there is a small body of English literature on Arab immigrants in Latin America, very little attention has been given outside of denominational church publications to the religious lives of migrants and the role of diaspora churches in maintaining these communities' connections to their Levantine heritage. The question of religious identity and the diversity of Middle Eastern Christianity in the diaspora is at the center of my current research project and has taken me to Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Mexico, as well as several hubs for Middle Eastern migrant communities in the United States. And with that, I'll close with a thank you. It was helpful for me to revisit this earlier book and to remind myself of what triggered my interest in Middle Eastern Christian migrations to begin with. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to questions and conversation.
Excellent, Deanna. Thank you so much. Let me just put it on gallery so that I can see everybody. Any immediate questions or comments? Perhaps I could just start. So, I mean, it's a general question actually for context. When did the phrase al-Nahda get coined? I mean, was there a quick realization that there was a change, um, an awakening, if you like,
Mm.
or is it something that is a retrospective um, classification of the time?
Mm. Oh, that's a great question. Um, Yeah, I think it was retrospective. I'd have to do a little bit of research to see when that term was actually, published in Arabic by the presses who were participating in the Nahda. But in terms of the periodicals that I used, that particular term wasn't uh, wasn't commonly used in the late 19th century. So I would say early 20th century sort of reflecting back. But I mean, at the same time, the people who we talk about as Arab Renaissance pioneers, they knew that they were participating in something new, that the presses they were founding, this was new, modern Arabic, I words like progress, and awakening and lightness as opposed to darkness, those kinds of contrasts were commonly used in describing like what their hopes were for their society. But in terms of naming a period as the Nahda,
Yeah.
I believe that was retrospective and came later.
And I think you touched on it. Obviously it was the time of the Tanzimat. How influential was that Ottoman um, change?
Hmm. Yeah, I think there were all sorts of currents that influenced the Arab Renaissance. So what I try to say in the book is the American missionaries were one of them. They provided some opportunities. The Tanzimat was also one of them. Various Ottoman reforms, the establishment of Ottoman schools, for example. Now, most of those would have been schools that Muslims went to. The Christians would tend to go to Christian schools. But so certain currents of the Nahda would have been very strongly influenced by Ottoman reforms, whereas others might have had other influencers. So some of the Christians were more influenced by outside Christian resources than they might have been by Ottoman kind of administrative changes.
And just keeping an eye on the audience. So, what would you say was the greatest motivator? Was it education, self motivation for education, literacy? Um, did it sort of coincide with other more liberal ideas about um, you know, the role of women at the time?
Yeah. And you mean the motivation for for participating in
Yes, I mean it's almost an awakening, and then so you wonder
the,
sort of what was the driver? Did they sort of get together, say, we're going to get together and we're going to make sure that we're going to improve literacy for the next generation.
yeah.
We're going to show those men what we can do, sort of thing. So
Yeah, so I mean, I think all of these sort of ideas were in the air, and people, as they encountered them in schools, it was sort of like they're breathing the water and they're drinking the water and breathing the air of the Renaissance. But for women in particular, I mean, I think there was a very strong feeling that was both common among Syrians, but also common among American Protestants, which makes it hard to know exactly, you know, where it's originating. But there was a very strong feeling that women, there's this phrase, like the woman who rocks the cradle holds the world in her hand, and so it's the mothers of the future have to be educated because they have to know how to bring up the children right. If the children aren't brought up right, then the entire nation is going to fail. And so there's this kind of umbrella, you know, sort of umbrella, like overarching understanding that women have a role in transforming the nation into a modern progressive place. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean equality and liberation for women. It means education, and then often, at least for the Protestants who, by our standards of measuring sort of progressive feminist movements, were quite conservative. Um, it means, that they're back in the home after they become educated and they're raising their children so that their children, especially their sons, can, can be the leaders of the Syrian nation. So there are some contradictions. I think looking back, we would see some contradictions here because the women are they're gaining a certain level of independence through education that they wouldn't have gotten before, but there are still mechanisms for kind of containing their ability to really wield power in society.
It still was a very strongly patriarchal society,
Mhm.
but I suppose what could be said is that women realised that actually by having that central role in the home and with other women, that they could influence things,
Mhm.
perhaps more than they realised in the past. James Bone, you're on mute.
Audio on. My audio's on now.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Um, I have a question about your current research,
Oh, sure.
um, which you briefly described, but I'm curious because I was writing a book about something completely different, and I came across the amazing background story, which was unknown, about an Armenian woman who was brought to America and basically was used to publicize the Armenian genocide.
Hmm.
Laura Mardiganian. I don't know whether you've ever come across her.
Yeah.
She her 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 life story was storified into a book which is sometimes called Ravished Armenia and sometimes called The
Oh,
Origin of Human Souls. And it became also a famous film that was a huge success in America in, I can't remember offhand now, but maybe roughly in 1918.
huh.
Um, and uh, but she was very exploited. She was 16 when she came, and she was kind of adopted by the American Christian missionary community,
Mhm.
and her story kind of co-opted by them and used as a vehicle to publicize the Armenian genocide of, I mean, the genocide of Armenian Christians. Um, and I just wanted to bring it to your attention because it is really a remarkable story. It was a huge, huge phenomenon in America at that time. This her story, both the book as a best-selling book and a movie, and quite by chance, I was doing a book that involved a a male journalist ghostwriter who was married to an American missionary,
Hmm.
and he was it. I quite by chance discovered that he was the ghostwriter who storified her book, which
Oh,
became this enormous phenomenon. So Aurora Mardiganian, I would recommend you have a look in. If it sounds like that's in your field of interest for this diaspora story.
wow. Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't heard of her particular story, so I really appreciate
It's
uh,
the
knowing more about that.
story that the Americans knew about the Armenian genocide.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it shows the tensions and contradictions, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And she
and
later sued. She later sued both the
Mm.
Christian missionary woman who took her in and the ghostwriter who made her famous, um,
Wow.
because they basically accusing them of exploiting her and also not giving her royalties,
Hmm.
either on the movie or on the book.
Wow. Yeah, really, really interesting. Yeah, this is very much along the lines of what I'll be writing
Yeah.
about
Have a look at that. It's it's
on Armenians. Yeah.
okay.
Let me ask you a question.
Thank
And
you.
my wife has a question on something completely different, I think.
Hi.
Hello, this is Shebnem. I was just curious. One of your characters, you said, Yosef Attia or Yusuf
Yes.
Attia. Can you tell us a little bit more about him? Where was he originally from? Where was because he sounds with a name that I'm familiar with, so I'm just
Hmm.
curious.
Oh, okay. Yes. So, yeah, there are a lot of Atiyahs in Lebanon. I'm trying to remember. So he lived in the Tripoli, like he lived near Tripoli,
Hmm.
in a small village, and I need to look back at my book. Unfortunately, I did the research for this book over a decade
Okay.
ago, not remembering the particular village, but he was from um, a Greek Orthodox background,
I
and
see. Not Jewish. Interesting. Yeah.
yeah, no,
Mm.
not Jewish as far as I know, but and then his daughter was also a writer for the Arabic press.
Yes, you said.
But
Yes.
that family has several Yeah, several things have been written about individuals in that family, and actually one of their descendants who lives in California contacted me recently. So if this is something of interest and you'd like to find out more about that family line, I maybe Quentin or Craig could share my
I'll
email.
look into your book as well. Yes.
Okay, I'd be happy to.
Okay,
I do
thank
have
you.
a
Thank you. That
family
was very
tree
nice.
at the back of the book that might be helpful as well. Thanks for
Thank
the
you.
question.
I mean, picking up on that, with some of the families that you identified then, have you traced how their descendants proceeded? Were they successful? I mean, Sarkis, of course, we know as the name, I think, former president of, I think, well, of Lebanon after the civil war, I think pro-Syrian side, if I remember rightly. Is that the same line? It'd be quite interesting to see, to what extent were these influential women and families contributors to the success of their descendants?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I have I lived in Lebanon for 2 years, and I spent quite a bit of time researching there. So I have come across a number of descendants of these people who are still Protestants. Of course, there are others who maybe didn't stay in the Protestant community. But the Protestant community there it's very small, but I would say disproportionately influential in terms of a social influence. So not they have one representative in parliament. I think they're not a real political factor. But in terms of the schools that they have operated and continue to operate, because Lebanon is a place that didn't nationalize its schools, like unlike Egypt, where all the mission schools were nationalized, Protestants are still running some of those schools today. American University of Beirut is probably, a larger one that's often named, but I've heard, especially recently, more about the AUB School of Nursing, and some of the Protestant women who were educated there, have migrated around the world and like have had, an impact in terms of the medical care that they have offered.
But I was thinking also, was there, let's say, a sense of competition between the evangelical missions and the local sort of Protestant communities? Did the evangelical sort of newcomers almost see them as a target for conversion? Say, look, come over to us. We've got more money. We've got backers from the United States and so on. Was that something that went on?
So, and you mean like the traditional mainline Protestants in comparison to more evangelical missions that came later? I mean, I know that there's some rather important history of Baptist missions that comes later. The Baptists don't really get to Lebanon until, maybe after the 1920s, 1930s. Now I think there are more sort of evangelical Pentecostal movements there. Are they? Yeah, I mean, they probably are trying to attract the traditional mainline
objectives and target numbers to hit. No doubt.
Would be an interesting research project, but not something that I've seen anybody write about.
Just on the diaspora side, clearly there was quite a bit of mobility that developed in the late 19th century. And I'm wondering, to what extent was that driven as economic migration, so they were better educated and wanted more to use that more in a different country, or was it to fundraise? I mean, clearly you pointed to some examples in your snapshots of people who came back and traveled between several times. But the question is really around the economic migration. Was that a driver?
Yeah, I think most of it was economic. Depending on who you talk to, they also talk about Ottoman persecution of Christians, and that as a cause. But I think really there was an economic downturn in at least certain parts of Lebanon. The sericultural industry, the silkworms, were dying out for some reason, and that was something that employed, like a lot of peasants. So I think there were multiple causes, but most of it was um, there's an opportunity to make more money and either send it back to your home or to make money and then come back and build a house, find a wife. It was often men for the Ottoman Syrian population overall. It was often single men who would travel to the U.S. or to Latin America, and then their intention for most of them was to return. That didn't happen for everyone. For the Protestants who migrated, I think it was a little bit different because certainly all of them had access to more educational opportunities than like some of their peers in other religious communities might have, and they may have learned English. So they had kind of more opportunity for higher socioeconomic status from the beginning. And then those who connected with mission circles or church circles in the U.S. also were hosted, like Hannah Kurani, the woman who lectured for a year after going to the Chicago World's Fair. And so that kind of, I don't know, maybe incentivized the migration even more to have that connection overseas. But I think I would say overall, both for Protestants and for Syrians in general who migrated, it was certainly for economic reasons. Yeah.
And was there any particular city that they headed to because there were already some there, and did a community? Because typically migration to the States, it's almost as communities moved, established a parallel community.
Yeah, so it was in New York, in Lower Manhattan, an area called Little Syria. And you can still see like some evidence of it today. There aren't really Syrians living there now, but you can see, some older buildings and pictures of that region. So New York was a hub, and then Detroit didn't really become a hub for Arab migrants until until the auto industry picked up and there were more jobs. But early on, a lot of the Syrians were either they opened up small businesses or they were peddlers. They were peddlers at first, and they sold kind of so-called Oriental objects or Holy Land objects, peddling and maybe selling them to housewives. So they would go to the Midwest and sell, and then kind of come back to New York. But Little Syria and Manhattan was kind of the hub for many.
And your mention of the silk industry, I mean, was that something which the Protestant community was a specialist in, or did they have any particular trades that they were known for, and also that they carried with them when they migrated?
That's a good question. So Akram Khater has written about his book on migration from Lebanon and return migration, talks about the sericultural industry. I didn't find so many Protestants who were working in that industry, or if they had been maybe before they became Protestant, once they had access to the education, they turned to other things. So a lot of them were employed by the mission. They became teachers, or they became preachers, or they found jobs like administrative jobs with diplomats, for example. They were translators. So the educational opportunities gave them, certain skills that they could use. But in terms of industry, besides several families who founded Arabic presses, I don't. I wouldn't say that was the main Protestant industry, but there are certain families who are known for founding presses and publishing. I I don't know that there was a particular industry that Protestants were kind of the specialists in.
I'm conscious I'm sort of rather hogging the questions. Anyone else got a question or a comment they'd like to ask? If not, I sort of have. I mean, one more. I was intrigued. So you've got some photographs of the women there. Were those from the journals? Because the sources must be quite hard to find, I'd have thought, unless there were publications that they were printed in.
Yeah, so for the images of most of the men that I show in the book, they came from mission archives Actually, at Yale, the Day Missions Library has a lot of material and has images from the kind of the early period of the mission. A few came from the Presbyterian Historical Society, but none of those none of those places, and also the Near East School of Theology, none of those places had photographs or even publications with women's pictures. The one of Leah Barakat was published in her English memoir. So I got that there. The one of Hannah Korani was published in a book about the Women's Congress at the Chicago World's Fair. And then the mission source where I found more pictures of women was actually the British Syria Mission publications. Their periodical is called Daughters of Syria. And of course, because they were a female-led mission and most of their schools were for girls, they had more pictures of women. And so I think all of the pictures of Bible women that I have came from the British Syrian women. I believe the Near East School of Theology had the one picture with all the Bible women sitting around Caroline Thompson and Salim Kassab, who was one of the male superintendents. So I did find that one in an archive, but almost everything else came from the British Syrian mission. And so some of the women who were connected to the American mission went to the British schools. But yeah, it's very difficult to find the women's photos I think because they weren't publishing as much, and maybe they're kept in family archives and not given to institutional archives.
I mean, I think that's often what we find is that, family archives will have pictures of the family. They would go to a professional photography studio, and I assume that there would have been one or more in Beirut.
Yes.
So perhaps it's really ask the family descendants, what have they got dating from that time, and you may strike lucky and get more images.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. The Atiyah family that I mentioned, the descendant who contacted me said that they have a family archive. So I think that's, beyond the institutional archives. You're right. If the families have kept a hold of it, then you might find a treasure trove.
So really, winding up, really, is there anything that we as a Levantine Heritage Foundation can help with, in connecting you to people like this? I mean, we're very happy to help if we can. We perhaps our network with more of the Syrian Lebanese side is not as broad yet, but it is an area that we're greatly interested in. So if we can help, you can ask the audience, but we can ask a wider audience, our whole network, if there's anything we can help you with, particularly in your current work on the diaspora.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that question. When I first envisioned the book, I was thinking even broader than the Americas. I had visited the Assyrian Cathedral in London and was maybe going to come back. I visited a Syriac church in Germany. But then I realized that one book, I couldn't do the whole world, the whole Middle Eastern diaspora in one book. So now I've decided to focus more closely on the Americas. But certainly anything that you find of interest, from the early 19th century onward in terms of migration. I'm balancing between kind of the broader story of migration and then, as I did with this book, I think it's important to kind of fill in the story with faces and names and actually, and individuals and families, stories of migration. So the Armenian young woman that James Bone talked about, for example, that sort of thing piques my interest, but I think is important for telling the pieces of this migration history.
And maybe you will find that there will be one family who not only has good archives, but also a willingness to open them up and see that, the relationship that their ancestors might have had with other families through intermarriage or through societies, and that one seam can really be a backbone of the research. Deanna, thank you so much. We really appreciate you putting that together and giving us your time. And we look forward to staying in touch. Thank you also to our audience. And we wish you all good evening and good day.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.